Hello everyone, welcome back to the podcast on the 19th of December 2017. I'm Adrian Lloyd, this is just my stupid opinion. Alright, so I'm sorry if this will not be the most interesting episode, but we're going to be covering a bill that is being pushed through the House of Commons right now and how it relates back to a bill from a couple years ago. And then we might have to get into a little bit of technical terms talking about bills. So there's that. We're also going to be discussing the UN recently, or the useless nations as I call them. They tried to have a vote in the Security Council in order to rescind what Donald Trump had done in recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So there was a vote in the Security Council, and of course America, who has their permanent veto, they ended up vetoing the vote. So we'll be talking about that, and we're also going to be talking about how that's going to be trying to get pushed into the UN General Assembly instead of the Security Council. So we'll be talking about that. And then we have a bit of a showdown between news sources. It's Daily Caller versus Buzzfeed. And when I say news source and I'm talking about Buzzfeed, I use that quite liberally. Perfectly honest, I don't know much about the Daily Caller. I haven't used them all that much or pay attention to them all that much. But Buzzfeed, when the whole fake news things happened, and I at first was a bit defensive of mainstream media. Actually, in my early episodes of the podcast, I was a little bit, and I explained that I have family inside media, so I saw things in a bit of a different way. However, recent events over the last couple of years have really changed my point of view. But anyway, when it first came out, I was a bit defensive, saying, like, you're fucking with the information system, which you are, and that's still a problem I have with it. But there's been plenty of reasons for people to call fake news. But when this came out and Trump decided when he became president that some of these fake news sources were no longer going to be allowed in the White House, which I'm pretty sure that got rescinded pretty fast. I'm pretty sure he said CNN and BuzzFeed were two that were not allowed. CNN's allowed for sure, but BuzzFeed was one I definitely agreed with, that it was not real news. BuzzFeed is a pop culture website, and then they try and pass off as news. And really, they're bullshit. Their investigation is done very poorly for the most part. There's been plenty of bad stories that have been pushed out of BuzzFeed. In fact, I would say BuzzFeed is one of the problems for starting up the narrative of fake news. So I know this might show a bit of bias before I even get into the story, but essentially what this is talking about, and it really depends on the facts of the story, is that the Daily Caller put out an article a few days ago where it was claiming that Linda Sarsour, the well-known Muslim activist and feminist, who is a hater of the Donald Trump administration, it came out that in the Arab American Association, which Linda Sarsour used to be the executive director for, there's an allegation coming out that apparently one woman was sexually assaulted and harassed on many occasions, and Linda Sarsour was well aware of it, covered it up, and even at times helped participate in the shaming and a bit of the assault itself. On the flip side, BuzzFeed is saying that this is a complete fabrication, and that many of the events that took place in the story that Daily Caller put out are either not true or cannot be corroborated, so we'll get into that a little bit more. So we'll start off with two of the more interesting stories today, and then we'll kind of get more into this bill that is being pushed through the House of Commons, and for people who want to stick around are more than willing. This bill is actually covering bestiality, so it may be kind of interesting to some people, but again, there'll be a lot of technicalities to it, so we'll get into that at the end. But in the meantime, let's start with what's going on at the useless nations. I personally have been against the United Nations since about late high school, I would say. Even when I went a little far the left wing after high school, I still found the United Nations were pointless and useless. And the reason I feel this is just whenever the United Nations actually can do something to help, they don't. While there are some good examples of the United Nations peacekeepers doing well in other nations, a good example of this was Cyprus, when Canadian peacekeepers, they walked the line of Cyprus to make sure that there was no fighting between the two forces. And there's a couple of other good examples of where the UN and the peacekeepers did well. But underneath those stories that we usually hear of where they did well, there's so many failures that nobody wants to talk about. A good example is the Rwanda Genocide that took place between 1993 and 1994. So during that time, we had the Tutsis and the Hutus. For those who have seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, this is exactly the genocide I'm talking about. And essentially, in Rwanda, in this small African country, I think it's in Central Africa, if I remember correctly. Essentially, you had two types of people that were divided up among race lines. And the funny thing was, well, it's not funny, but I want to guess if you want to say ironic thing is it was two different races of black people, as they would describe it. On one side, you had the Hutus, and the Hutus were usually darker, had bigger lips, larger noses. And then on the other side, you had the Tutsis, and the Tutsis were usually lighter skin, smaller noses, smaller lips. Generally, the difference is the Tutsis usually had more European look to them. They were lighter skinned and stuff. Because of this, and especially because of the history, I believe, of the British inside of Africa, the Tutsis tended to get special treatment. This led to a lot of friction, to eventually where the Hutus rose up and they ended up slaughtering millions of Tutsis. Well, maybe not millions. I think it was about 1 million by everything was done. While this was going on, there were UN blue helmets on the ground in Rwanda. Not many, but they were there because the situation was getting out of control. Lots of social uprising and lots of violence. So they were there to monitor the situation. And at the time, the one who was leading the UN Peacekeepers was, I cannot remember if he was a colonel or a general, but he was a former Canadian soldier. And yeah, colonel or general. And so as he watched the events going on, he saw the slaughter taking place. All of them saw the slaughters taking place. And he was relaying back to the UN what was going on. He was telling them, this is a genocide. People are being slaughtered. You need to do something about this. And the UN in General Assembly refused to use the word genocide. See, if they had used the word genocide inside the General Assembly at the UN, then they had to do something. Because if it's a genocide, the UN has to intervene. That's the way their rules work. But they didn't. They refused this. They refused and they refused and they refused, despite the fact that this Canadian colonel or general was like screaming at them, it's a genocide. We need to do something here. In the end, once everything was said and done, that's when the UN classified it as a genocide. After all the slaughtering was done and the rebellion versus the government forces had finally stopped fighting against each other, because of course when you start genociding one race, there's going to be a rebellion that rises up. So there was a rebellion of Tutsis against these Hutu government, because for a time, part I may have left out is the Tutsis were the dominant power inside Rwanda, and they tended to treat the Hutus as second-class citizens. So when this changed and a Hutu government came into power, the Hutus became the brutal ones towards the Tutsis. Another thing that led to this genocide happening is that I believe it was a Hutu president at the time. Yeah, it was a Hutu president at the time. He went to go meet with the Tutsi rebels who ended up killing him. So the military and the rest of their forces, this is when they began their slaughter. But the UN did nothing. They did nothing, despite the fact they had plenty of opportunities to. And there's many other stories where they had opportunities to intervene, opportunities to help, and they didn't. Meanwhile, an article comes out over the last couple days saying that the UN wants to put blue helmet peacekeeping troops in Chicago. Yeah, Chicago's pretty fucking bad, don't get me wrong. There's lots of murders and shit going on there. But you're going to put blue helmets in Chicago? There are worse fucking places in the world. So this is why I call them the useless nations. They don't really do much. They like to sit there and pat themselves on the back, but they don't actually really accomplish anything. So that's my beef with the United Nations, and I've thought they've been worthless since about grade 12 or grade 11 law class. So we're talking about 17 years old roughly since then that I've thought they were useless. And no matter what point my political philosophies have taken me, if I went a little more left, if I went a little more right, I never thought the United Nations did a good job. I've always called them the useless nations. But anyway, getting back into our story, I'm done my rant about the United Nations. The Security Council is made up of several key members of the United Nations. Some of them have permanent sitting at the Security Council. Canada used to be part of the Security Council, and then we lost it when we were under Harper. But the U.S. has a permanent seat on the Security Council. And because of this, because the U.S. has a permanent seat on the Security Council, they have a permanent veto. And America's veto is like the ultimate veto. Whatever America says or does, pretty much the UN has to follow suit. Kind of the advantages, too, of having the UN on home territory, because if I remember correctly, it's stationed in New York. So anyway, the Security Council put together, it was a draft resolution which was calling for the withdrawal of U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This is according to a Reuters report. So in order for this to pass, it needed at least 9 votes, and there couldn't be any vetoes from any of the 5 permanent seats on the Security Council. And those are the United States, France, Britain, Russia, and China. So the Security Council actually voted 14 votes in favor of this draft, and America was the one who voted against it. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was pretty happy about this. He ended up putting out a message on his Facebook thanking President Trump and America for vetoing this vote. So because of this now, many are trying to get it moved into the General Assembly, where all about 190 different nations can then vote on this issue. But the draft itself was put together by Egypt, and as it says, it calls for all states to refrain from the establishment of diplomatic missions in the holy city of Jerusalem, end quote. Personally, I don't think Egypt was the best idea to be drafting a proposal against Jerusalem and Israel, considering the history that they have had with Israel. It's a pretty large bias for them to be coming from. Of course, they are a Muslim country now, so this is why they're pissed off, and they just don't like Israel. In the 1967 war, this was one of the 5 different nations that lined up on Israel's border, prepared to invade and pretty much destroy the entire country. So for them to then draft this proposal, which is complaining about Israel and Jerusalem, in my opinion, is a little bit ironic, considering how they were at one point in recent history too. Within the life of my dad, they were prepared to completely wipe Israel off the map and take Jerusalem for themselves. So I guess I'm just saying I would have preferred to see somebody a little less, destruction-y trying to draft this proposal. If it was someone like France that drafted this proposal, let's just say, then I could actually see more where they're coming from rather than Egypt. Because Egypt doesn't actually have any claim over Jerusalem. It would be Palestine, if there is any claim, that could make some claim over Jerusalem. So Egypt doesn't actually benefit from this, aside from the fact that they have religious reasons to be behind it. And the 2 different sides essentially taken on this proposition, as reported in this Reuters, however they pronounce their name. In this article, it says, Israel considers the city its eternal and indivisible capital and wants all embassies based there, while Palestine wants the capital of an independent Palestinian state to be in the city's eastern sector, which Israel captured in 1967 war and annexed in a move that was never recognized internationally. And once again, leaving out the complete history of what really went down in that war. But yes, that is what happened. I believe, though, that really Palestine would gladly take all of Jerusalem to themselves, but considering how it's right now being recognized, at least by America, the most powerful country in the world, it's being recognized as Israel's capital, and Israel's kind of the powerhouse of the region. Then when I look at it, it seems more like they're just going for whatever they can get. East Jerusalem is a possibility, but I have no doubt that if they were influenced, they'd be calling for all of Jerusalem themselves, because just like Israel, they have religious reasons to want Jerusalem. It's not quite as important to maybe the Muslims as it is to the Jews, but it is still a very important, iconic place for their religion. This is all religion-based, really. And also, in this draft that was put forward by the Egyptians, it says that, quote, demands that all states comply with the Security Council's resolution regarding the Holy City of Jerusalem and not to recognize any action or measure contrary to those resolutions, end quote. Well, that's just the useless nations trying to tell everyone how to fucking conduct themselves. Jesus Christ. We are sovereign, independent nations, and we can do whatever we want. These sort of actions are exactly the sort of thing that people on the right wing worry about when they talk about globalism and shit like this. They're worried about a worldwide one unity power being able to tell every other sovereign nation what to do. This is kind of what the UN is doing, and it's just in a very small way. It's just telling them not to recognize and not to act politically on certain ways. But this is exactly the sort of thing that they're against. And with good reason. I mean, who the fuck is the UN, despite the fact we all participate, and we participate in it voluntarily? We all volunteer in the UN. That's it. We volunteer in the UN because we're trying to all work towards a better world. That's what it's supposed to be about. But that does not mean that the United Nations can then dictate how other sovereign countries handle themselves or how they want to recognize one way or the other. Are we not allowed dissenting opinion in the useless nations now? Is this too much to ask to say we might think differently than you? Probably. It's probably being taken over by that same progressiveness that is actually infesting everywhere else, where they say, if you don't agree with me, then you're fucking hateful. Because in a sense, this is exactly what the United Nations is doing to America. They are isolating America from the rest of the world because America isn't going along with what they want. So they were perfectly fine and dandy and happy with America as long as they were doing what the United Nations wanted. But the second that the UN says, I don't agree with that, I don't like that, even if it is something like this, the UN is then trying to isolate them from the rest of the world. Probably not the best idea when it's the most powerful nation in the world to isolate yourselves. You may want their help one way or another in the future. And Donald Trump, to me, seems like the type of president that remembers a grudge. So if you've pissed him off as a country and then you're looking for his help later on, I don't think you're going to get it. So now that that's failed, Turkey is trying to pass a resolution in the UN General Assembly, as I stated, to get them to vote on it. And essentially this, if the UN General Assembly voted on it and passed, because there wouldn't be the same vetoes, I don't believe, as there would be in the Security Council, they can essentially reverse Donald Trump recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We'll get into that in a minute, but let's just continue talking about this at the UN right now. And one of the reasons that Turkey and Palestine and a few other these are trying to get this pushed in the General Assembly is due to this resolution. It's the 1950 Resolution 377A, and it says that if the Security Council fails to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, the General Assembly shall consider the matter immediately. What I find a little bit ironic about this whole thing is we've got Turkey, we've got Palestine, we've got Egypt. Pretty much Muslim-dominated countries who are talking about how this is a threat to international peace. But the real threat right now is coming from the citizens in those areas that are protesting and rioting and using weapons in order to try and get America and Israel to rescind what had happened about Jerusalem being recognized as Israel's capital. But that's really where the violence and the threat is coming from. Yes, there has been problems on both sides. I've already talked about this when I covered this last time. Israel fucks up a lot too. Palestine fucks up a lot. But the problem right now is it's not Israel. It's not the Israeli Defense Force that went in and started shit with the Palestinians to get them to riot. It was Donald Trump who made a decision, and then the Palestinians in the region started to riot. And some are dead. Some are dead. Some Palestinians are dead, and I don't know if any Israeli Defense Force members have been dead yet, but I know that there have been some that have been attacked and injured. I know there was one Palestinian man that was killed. He was committing a knife attack against an Israeli Defense Force member, and he ended up stabbing him. But again, we're going to come back to that in just a minute. I want to finish this. I know I'm trying to stop myself from ranting. But as we continue, it says, the resolution can be passed by getting at least 2/3 of the votes of the members of the UN General Assembly. Quote, Turkey, as well as other OIC members, are working hard to increase it, end quote, the foreign ministry source said. And the OIC is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, founded in 1969. It bills itself as the collective voice of the Muslim world. So that's who OIC is, and Turkey has been leading the call of this 57-member OIC in order to get this resolution passed in the General Assembly. Okay, so that's pretty much wraps up our story about what went down in the UN for now, until we hear more about what happens with this in the General Assembly. So if I can go back to my rants, the problem is that it's these civilians that are committing these acts of violence, and it's forcing the Israeli Defense Forces to respond with almost equally amount of force, except they're better armed. So they're hitting them with tear gases, and they have guns, so if somebody comes up to attack them, they can shoot them instead of having a club to smack them with or something like this. But even these riots are much more dangerous from the other side than we really believe. Because if we even look at the media video of what's going on, it can look bad on both sides. We can see Israel Defense Forces being very aggressive with the rioters. We can also see the rioters being very aggressive with the Israeli Defense Forces. But something that probably not a lot of people are taking into consideration, let's see if you can spot it in the video.
Dari has been following the unrest.
We're still at Nahl Oz buffer zone and tensions are increasing. The Israeli army are throwing tear gas bombs, as you can see, actually raids of tear gas bombs. They're also throwing live bullets. We can hear the live bullets. As you can see, tear gas bombs are filling the place. People are running.
We also got some interesting footage. The Israeli army has admitted using undercover agents to arrest Palestinian protesters. So in this video, you can see how several people dressed as civilians help IDF officers in riot gear to detain demonstrators. You can also see that they turned out to be armed, drawing their guns as soon as that arrest started. In the West Bank, violence broke out after the funeral of one of the victims killed in Friday's protests. Palestinians threw rocks at the Israeli security forces, who responded with tear gas and rubber bullets. Local journalist Hind.
So on one side, we have these well-armored and well-equipped Israeli soldiers. On the other side, we have very basic civilians using whatever they can, throwing stones, using slings, just whatever they can in order to fight back, essentially, or I guess riot, because they're really the ones who are causing the disruption in the area. I mean, if we kind of look at it here, if half our citizens started rioting over a decision that was made that they didn't like, and the police had to use aggressive tactics in order to put them down, a lot of people probably wouldn't blame the police officers because half our fucking citizens are rioting over a decision. At least that's the way I see it. Again, I see it as a stupid argument just because it's all religious based. And I think that people who are willing to do this just based on a religious text are kind of stupid, to be honest. I don't want to just classify everybody underneath an umbrella, but if you're prepared to riot and kill and hurt and maim because some book tells you that this city rightfully is yours, then yeah, I think you're an idiot. It's one thing to believe that, it's another thing willing to commit acts of violence and possibly kill people over it. But anyway, the thing I was talking about before when I said people aren't taking it into consideration is at the end of that video that we saw actually a fair few of Palestinian rioters using slings. Most of us would probably laugh at this, ha ha ha, it's a sling, you know, what can they do with a sling? Actually, a lot. You can do a lot of damage with a sling. And we can just take a look here in this video. In this one series from History Channel, it was called Battles BC, and it was these military historians that discuss a lot of ancient battles, and sometimes they covered a few from the Bible about what technically went on. So, for instance, they talk about Joshua as he led the Israelites through the Holy Land, and they talked about sort of what his battle strategy was, and sort of the Battle of Jericho, what maybe really took place there. In this one, they were covering about the possibility of what if David fought Goliath. So, as we all know, David used a sling. So they actually tested out and see, could you possibly kill somebody with a sling? Well, let's take a look.
So for a missile the size and shape of a sling bullet, how much force needs to be exerted in order to kill?
If we're talking about how much force that is necessary to kill somebody by an impact to the brain, anything over 3,000 newtons spread over an area of 30 millimeters squared is enough to kill a human being. A shockwave goes through the brain and causes the brain to strike the inside of the brain case, irreversibly damaging the brain tissue to such an extent that it couldn't work again.
3,000 newtons, or 3 kilonewtons, is equivalent to the force necessary to smash a concrete block in half.
3.62 kilonewtons.
So as you can see, 3 kilonewtons was needed in order to crack someone's skull and kill them. They were able to produce 3.6 kilonewtons, more than enough to kill somebody. They said that was necessary to crack the side of a concrete block. Then that is technically possible to crack the side of a concrete block, probably enough to crack your skull if it hit in the right area. So the point is when these rioters are using slings, they are using deadly weapons. People may laugh at slings these days, but slings were actually sort of the poor man's ranged weapon. And they used it because it was cheap, but it was effective. It's not like they just used it and it didn't do much. It was a very effective weapon. Somebody throws a rock at your head, that hurts enough. Now grab a fucking sling. On top of all the leverage that you're getting from the extra rope, you're also twirling it above your head for a few seconds, which is building up momentum and speed. You can really hurt someone, if not kill somebody, with a sling. So they should be considered using deadly weapons in those. Even though many people would complain on the other side, the Israelis have guns. But I think that needs to be taken into consideration when analyzing this sort of violence. My last thing on this is, do we really expect this to do anything? Even if America had not vetoed that Security Council vote, and everybody voted in favor, and so in fact it was rescinded that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. Is that really supposed to stop the violence that's going on in the Middle East? Is that honestly going to make all these protesters, all these rioters calm down, go home, and say, all right, we got what we came here to fight for? I don't believe that for a second. You could sit there and say, well, we voted and now it's been rescinded. I do not believe for a second that these people will then be satisfied. The damage is done. When Donald Trump did that, the damage was done. And I said before, doing it was a stupid decision because we knew what would happen. But the damage is done. So we need to look at real possibilities of how to stem the violence. We need to look at real possibilities of how to come to some sort of resolution. We don't need to start having some bullshit vote and then that's supposed to make everybody feel good, because it only makes the people in the political world feel good. It only makes those that are actually involved in that feel that making that vote actually makes a difference, that is going to see this positively. But the average person, the average Muslim living in Palestine or around that area and how they view Jerusalem, that vote ain't going to mean shit. I mean, you're trying to equivalate, in their point of view, a human vote of an organization put together by Westerners to what they see as the word of God. Good luck with that. You're really wasting everybody's time and proving that you are, in fact, the useless nations. Okay, I think I've raged as much as I can against the United Nations. And I want to change this up now. So let's talk a little bit about this controversy going around Linda Sarsour. On one side, we got the Daily Caller, which is a conservative website. It was actually started up by Tucker Carlson before he started working for Fox News. And then on the other side, we have Buzzfeed, which is the well-established SJW website, essentially. If you want to get your news from anything that deals with social justice and extreme progressiveness, then that is where you go. And as I've already stated, in my opinion, the epitome of what they call fake news. So essentially, what ended up happening with these accusations against Linda Sarsour, who is a well-known Muslim activist and feminist. She was actually the leader of the Women's March at the beginning of the year, of 2017, back in January, where all the pussy hats and shit were coming about. She was leader of that movement. And she's had plenty of different controversies going around her ever since she's come into more mainstream light, I would say. I only really took notice of her at the beginning of this year. I don't know if she was really that well known beforehand, but anyway. So I have big problems with many things she's talked about, and I think she just says stupid shit and tries to do stupid shit. I mean, in this day and age, with all that ISIS has done and all the different extreme Islamic ideologies and terrorist attacks that go around, she thinks it's a good idea to try and use jihad in a just regular way and say like, oh, we need to do a jihad against the Trump administration, meaning just like a struggle they need to push back, but yet she doesn't seem to think that this is going to cause a huge uproar. Meanwhile, when ISIS and all these extreme Muslim ideologies have called jihad against everybody in the West, and we've had countless of terrorist attacks where thousands of people have died, and she doesn't see a problem of using that term. I'm sorry, even if that term does mean something else such as struggle, it has, because of what it has been used for and how it has been manipulated, even if that was the original case, it just meant a struggle, it means something completely different these days, especially to Westerners. So first off, it is worth noting that this article was put out, and this has actually been used one of the main defenses people have used against these accusations going against Linda Sarsour of her following. One of the main things that they've thrown against her is that this article was written by someone named Benny Johnson, and he actually used to work for Buzzfeed, but he was fired back in 2015, if I remember correctly, because there were accusations of plagiarism against him. When Buzzfeed looked into some about 200 articles he put out, about 40 of them turned out to be plagiarized, so they fired him. He ended up going on to work for another company called Independent Journal Review, and he ended up getting suspended and then fired from there in 2017 because one of his articles didn't meet their editorial standards. So he has some controversy around him, but this is the main accusation getting thrown out against him. So clearly, he's not a very good journalist. That needs to be addressed before you even look into this article. But one thing I thought was a little funny about this is if we look at these tweets by Linda Sarsour, side by side, she's willing to completely use BuzzFeed to defend herself, while at the same time essentially shitting on them to defend herself. She uses the article where they say that, it's probably not real, and they're like, oh, thank you, this is real journalism and stuff like that. Meanwhile, they're talking about this guy who got fired from BuzzFeed. They're just saying that there's no standards and ethics anymore. Now, I know she's probably more talking about that guy, but considering how both are BuzzFeed, she's pretty much shitting on BuzzFeed for having no journalistic ethics, and then at the same time praising BuzzFeed for having journalism ethics. Well, which one is it, Linda? Is it one or the other? You can't praise the same fucking news source for being terrible and then great at the same time, all within a goddamn day. If you look at the timelines, one was about 14 hours before I saw it, and the other one was only about 50 minutes, almost an hour before. So within the same goddamn 24-hour time frame, she praised them and shat on them. Alright, but the accusations against her are that she ignored and even enabled sexual assault against an employee that used to work for her back in the day. The allegations of groping and unwanted touching were allegedly brought to Sarsour during her time as executive director of the Arab American Association. In response, Sarsour, a self-proclaimed champion of women's rights, attacked the woman bringing the allegation, often threatening and body-shaming her. These sources alleged. The most serious allegations were dismissed. Azmi Fadhlbad, the alleged victim, told the Daily Caller, because of the accused was, quote, a good Muslim who was always at the mosque. That's according to our alleged victim. And she has at least 2 more people that used to work for her that were backing up her story. And we'll get into them a little bit soon. But she says, quote, she oversaw an environment unsafe and abusive to women. Women who put Sarsour on a pedestal for women's rights and empowerment deserve to know how she really treats us. So this victim is a 37-year-old New York native and was raised in a Muslim household. She worked for the Arab American Association with Sarsour, and she also worked for Sarsour for almost about a year, according to employment documents reviewed and authenticated by the Daily Caller. So our victim goes on to say that working for the Arab American Association, it was an unsafe work environment, and that, in fact, it was a man called Majid Saif who used to assault her. And essentially, what he used to do is he used to sneak up behind her with a full erection, and then he used to just, hug her, dry hump her, whatever. This is what she was claiming. And just as well as stalking her. She says that it started in 2009, and he originally began by stalking her. So when this was all going on, and a few times she said that when she was assaulted, she screamed at the top of her lungs and nobody came. And she also asserted that at times Linda Sarsour was around. Anyway, so she said she brought it up to Linda Sarsour. Linda Sarsour completely ignored it and even actually kind of threatened her about not bringing it up again. So our victim says that when once she didn't get anything from Sarsour, she ended up going up higher and she went to the president of the board of directors, Ahmed Jabber. I think it's called Jabber. And anyway, our victim ends up saying, quote, Jabber told me my stalker was a God-fearing man who was always at the mosque, so he wouldn't do something like that. He wanted to make it loud and clear that the guy was a good Muslim and I was a bad Muslim for complaining. So she said once she was dismissed on here and she kept trying to bring it up to other people, she actually started facing disciplinary actions against her, to the point where she had to speak to a detective about making false accusations about people. And as she says in a quote, she says, she told me I never worked in New York City ever again as long as I had lived, Azmi said. She kept her word. She had me fired from other jobs when she found out where I worked. She had kept me from obtaining any sort of steady employment for almost a decade. So as I stated, she had 2 people that were backing up her story. These were anonymous sources. They didn't want to be named. But they did end up saying that Azmi would, during her time when she worked for this organization, Azmi would return emotionally distressed and in panic from work, often describing it as an unsafe work environment. She also had another New York political operative who spoke on condition of anonymity, claims that Sarsour was militant against other women at the association. This operative, who has worked for over 12 years with the Arab American Association, say they remember Azmi and witnessed her getting harassed in the building. The source even identified Azmi alleged assaulter without prompting, Majid Saif, the man who lived in the building. So this story was actually reached so high up that New York Democratic State Representative Dov Hinken is calling for an investigation into Linda Sarsour to see whether these allegations are true. Now, of course, Linda Sarsour and other people who are, her fan base, they are denying these allegations, and they point a lot to this Buzzfeed article as their defense. So I went looking into these writers for Buzzfeed to try and see if I can find anything. While it was very limited in what I could find, I found Hannah Allam's Twitter feed, and it was just very filled with what you would expect somebody from Buzzfeed to be filled with, a lot of progressiveness. And then on the other one, we had Talal Ansari. He was the second co-author of this Buzzfeed article. Well, I couldn't find his Twitter feed or anything, but I did see an image from him from where he graduated at UC Berkeley. And yeah, UC Berkeley has had a pretty bad reputation, especially over 2017, for being the home of social justice and just intolerance towards other opinion. There were plenty of riots and shit that went down at UC Berkeley over this past year. So this BuzzFeed article, it goes on to talk about how these accusations are actually false. And one thing that they state is Linda Sarsour ended up providing an affidavit which states that she had handled any form of sexual assault or harassment appropriately. Now, this being said, BuzzFeed didn't print this. They just said that they had been handed this by Linda Sarsour. I figured if it had been handed to them by Linda Sarsour and they had it and they said that this was a defense showing she did well, they would print it. But they didn't. At least, not that I saw. Maybe I'm just blind and I need new glasses, but I didn't see the affidavit in there. All they did is said that they had an affidavit. And essentially, for anybody who doesn't know, an affidavit is just a legal document that states whatever is in the document is true, and then you sign it. I actually had to sign an affidavit for my OSAP funding because I got married this past summer between my 2 school years. So I had to sign an affidavit telling them that I was agreeing that, yes, I had in fact gotten married. And it's a legal binding document, so that's what it is. But where is this affidavit then, BuzzFeed? I'd really like to see it. Sarsour on Monday provided BuzzFeed News with a witness statement and an email correspondence that offers a remarkably different version of what happened when then staff member Azmi Fathel-Bab accused the office volunteer of harassing her in 2009. As referenced to in the document Sarsour provided, she gave ACES, Arab Community Center for Economics and Social Services, an affidavit dated August 13, 2009. Sarsour defended Saif in the statement and wrote that it was Fathel-Bab who was creating a hostile environment by telling co-workers stories of alleged harassment. Sarsour claims that she looked into these accusations and she didn't find anything reputable in them, and that's why nothing was done. And she's claimed that none of Fathel-Bab's claims to the Daily Caller matched the account she brought in Sarsour nearly 9 years ago. She said she started changing the story. She said that there was no screaming, and in fact the groping and that was much different. She said before that in a quote in Fathel-Bab's exact words, it was, "He makes me uncomfortable." And even when BuzzFeed did interview the last two of the 2 people that came to Fathel-Bab's defense, they ended up sticking by their story. And it goes off to say, and the article kind of closes off saying, Sarsour provided BuzzFeed News several materials supporting her version of events, including an August 13, 2009 statement to Saif, the accused volunteer, who said he'd never been around Fathel-Bab without another staff member present, and that the claim against him were, quote, offensive and hurtful. Signed statements dated August 14, 2009, in which 2 staff members who worked closely with Fathel-Bab told Access they had no reason to believe the claim. Now we come to an interesting situation. Is this all bullshit, or is there validity to it? Usually in something like this, I find it's somewhere down the middle. I think the story may be slightly exaggerated, but I think all in all, this woman, Azmi Fathel-Bab, actually did face harassment and sexual assault inside the Arab American Association. Whether Linda Sarsour really tried to actively cover it up, I'm not sure, but there are accusations that she was directly involved, in fact, fat-shaming her and just trying to make the girl just close up and not tell anybody. If these accusations are true against Linda Sarsour, then this becomes very interesting. This is a woman that has heavily been in the talk about how rape victims and sexual assault victims should be believed, how we need to stand by them, blah, 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 blah. So if this is the case, then, and she's lying, well, that's kind of a fast turn, and it kind of reminds me of the Lena Dunham story where she was saying those exact words, that no woman ever lies about rape, and then defends her writer from rape accusations. It almost sounds like the same thing, so we're going to have the same controversy. But right now, it's hard to tell because we don't have much. I found that the Daily Caller article was much more detailed than the BuzzFeed article was. And again, BuzzFeed talked about a few things. Like I said, they had the affidavit and these statements and these emails. but none of them were printed. Not even redacted to tell you who they were, and where you can read what was said. None of it was printed. Where is this evidence? You should be posting this evidence, and I have no doubt that if this is actually fake, Linda Sarsour would be against you posting this evidence. So where is it? She apparently gave it to you. This is where my suspicion comes in, is that we have on one side, the Daily Caller has a pretty detailed article describing what happened, as well as multiple witnesses. While witness statement can, again, not necessarily be reliable, and usually hard evidence is better, on the other side, we have Buzzfeed that is claiming hard evidence, but they're not displaying any of it. That makes me really suspicious. And again, considering the history of Buzzfeed, I'm really not that convinced that their side is the one I should trust. And I'm not saying that I should trust Daily Caller all at once, but it's somewhere in the middle, I think, where the truth of this story is. But I do think that Linda Sarsour had some part to play in this assault. It's unless it's just another completely fabricated story meant to discredit someone, and as Linda Sarsour calls it, a smear campaign. That's all it can be. But if these accusations are even remotely true, that is very damaging for who Linda Sarsour is, who she tries to carry herself to be, and what she preaches. Alrighty, we're going to move on to our final story of the day, and today we are discussing Bill C-388. It is a private member's bill that is going through the House of Commons right now, and it is discussing bestiality. Essentially what this bill hopes to do is rewrite the criminal code in order to cover more specifics when it comes to bestiality. So one of the reasons this bill is trying to be pushed through, because as it stands in Canada, bestiality is defined as there has to be penetration between an animal and a human. So in a male's case, he has to penetrate the animal or be penetrated. In the female's case, she has to be penetrated. So this has led to some court cases where people have gotten off bestiality charges when they should have rightfully been charged. And a good example of this is one that happened this past year in 2016 in BC. And a BC man was charged with 10 accounts of sexual assault and molestation and 1 account of bestiality. He had 2 stepdaughters that he had been molesting over, I think it was almost a 10-year period. Yeah, over a 10-year period. This was the court case R.v.D.L.W. That was all they classified the defendant as, D.L.W. So, the court case is R.v.D.L.W. And what ended up happening is the man, as I said, he had been sexually assaulting his 2 stepdaughters over a 10-year period. But in this one specific circumstances, when one of his daughters was about 15 or 16 years old, he ended up bringing the dog into the room with him. And he tried to get the dog to have sex with his daughter, but it didn't end up working. So what he did instead is he ended up smearing peanut butter on her vagina and had the dog lick it off. It was found in court that the man did this purely for sexual reasons. It was for his own sexual gratification that he did this. And in his original court case, he was convicted of these 10 charges of molestation, and he was also convicted of the 1 charge of bestiality, in which case then he was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He appealed this to the Court of Appeals, and they ended up overruling the charge because they said that penetration was necessary. So he could still get charged with his 10 counts of sexual assault and molestation, but the bestiality charge was getting dropped. So then this went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court of Canada also dropped the charges. So he still got his sexual molestation and assault charges, but no bestiality charges. Because they said it actually required penetration. And in something like this, where they say a legal term is well defined in both the legal sense and also in Parliament, then Parliament, even if they did not intend it to be that way, they are using it in the defining term. So when we apply this to bestiality, when they say bestiality requires penetration, that means that because it's a well-defined legal term, and it's supposed to be well established in Parliament as to what it is, that means that penetration is required for bestiality. So because of this bill what was it again? Bill C-388 which is being introduced by Michelle Rempel, is trying to cover all those bases to make sure that bestiality is not just considered penetration, but sexual interaction with an animal. So in this situation, if this law had already been in place, then probably this man would be in prison right now with a bestiality charge on top. But the thing that also should piss people off even more about this is that 2 years ago, in 2015, there was a possibility for that to happen. There was a possibility to have that loophole covered up. It was a Bill C-246, which ended up getting killed. It was introduced by a Liberal MP called Nathan Erskine Smith. He is the Liberal MP for the Beaches East York riding in Toronto. This bill was called the Modernizing Animal Protections Act, and it would amend the criminal code to consolidate and modernize various offenses against animals, but it ended up getting defeated on October 5th, 2016. So what this bill would have done, the enactment amends the Fisheries Act to prohibit practice of shark finning, and the Wild Animal and Plant Protection and Regulation of International and Interprovincial Trade Act to prohibit the importation of shark fins that were not attached to the rest of the shark carcass. This is a big problem in fishery, is shark finning. You're just cutting off the shark fins and that's it, and throwing them away. It's very cruel. It's a very cruel act to do. Even though sharks can really be a bitch to us sometimes, we do a lot more damage to the sharks than the sharks do to humans. It also amended the Textile Labeling Act to modify requirements in respect of animal hair and fur and cat and dog skin, their hair and fur as well. It also amended the Canadian Consumer Production Safety Act to add products made in whole or in part of dog or cat fur or skin to Schedule 2 to that act to prohibit those products from being imported into Canada or manufactured, advertised, or sold in Canada. One reason that it's believed that the bill was defeated originally is because the animal industry has a lot of pull in Parliament, so they believe they played a big part of this. And we can even see that if we look back in those days at those articles, the sort of thing they're pushing. In fact, in my opinion, when I look back at these, a lot of them were bullshit in the sort of thing that they were talking about. See, in one article that dealt with fishing, they were talking about how fishermen can now be arrested and thrown in prison just for going fishing. And one thing they pointed to was section 182.1. And that article says, everyone commits an offense who willfully or recklessly kills an animal or being the owner permits an animal to be killed brutally or viciously regardless of whether the animal dies immediately. So essentially they were using this quote here to say, well, if you go fishing and that means you kill the fish, then that means you can get arrested and you can throw it in prison. But when that wasn't actually the case, because if we look through the rest of the bill, it actually specified that that was not going to be the case. And I'll show you right here. Because Part C says, kills an animal without a lawful excuse. When you go hunting or fishing, you have licenses in order to do these. And you have areas you can go to times a year, blah, 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 blah. There are restrictions on them. But you have a license in order to go do this. So this would not affect the hunters. This would not affect the fishermen because they have a license to go do what they do. But what it was promising, this act, was saying that cat and dog fur, that would have to be monitored and made sure that people were aware that this is sort of what's happening. And then when it was talking about the Fisheries Act, it was talking about how it just made sure it was essentially closing the loophole on shark finning. And if we even went back and checked out the debate that happened, which you can do, I've even linked for anyone who wants to go check it out, I've linked in the description to where the bill was introduced, and they have the text of the debate that happened. Michelle Rempel herself, when it first came out, sort of stood up and said that she wanted some clarification on the language of when it says brutally or viciously. She said she wanted clarification on there just because those are two very broad terms, to which this MP, Liberal MP Smith, said he was more than willing to do. He's like, yeah, okay, we can update the language and make that official. We can make it clear that people know what acts we're talking about. This would have been one of the best sort of animal protection bills that would have been put in place, and it would have covered bestiality and just covering it from penetration to sexual acts with an animal. But it was killed. And it was killed by most of the Liberals who voted against it, including our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who voted against it. It was killed by many Conservatives MPs, many who had either influences, money, or history in farming. A lot of them were saying that they felt that this bill was going to affect them. Really, I think for the most part, nobody had to worry about this because there was going to be things that were going to be allowed. I don't think they would ever actually go after a farmer for who's trying to, go and take care of their cattle, who kills their cattle for certain reasons, say for food. But this bill was killed, and this court case that went on, had this law been put in place, would have been a very different outcome, but it's not. And there are other court cases as well that cover similar situations where people have been let off for bestiality charge because technically what they didn't do had penetration. So this is why Michelle Rempel is trying to push this other bill. It's a private member's bill, which means that it can only be introduced by a member of parliament. It can't be introduced by a minister, and there has to be a petition of supporters behind it. So this is being introduced by her because of that. It's a little bit different. It's still considered a public bill, but it varies a little bit different from a government bill, which introduced by the government, of course. And then there's also private bills. Sorry, that's different from a private bill is different from a private member's bill. A private member bill falls underneath a public bill, while a private bill, that has to do usually with individuals, corporations, organizations that are looking for a bit of a law change rather than an actual dealing with popular opinion, which a public bill does. Generally, a public bill deals with popular opinion and what the public wants. Those will be the situations that are getting addressed. Private bill is just looking to update certain laws and statutes to accommodate organizations, individuals, corporations, whatever it might be. So that's really the difference between the types of bills that could have been introduced in this. I don't know if it's true, but I've also heard that a private member's bill means that that the MPs are free to vote as they want and they're not restricted to voting the way their party wants to. I don't know if that's true, but that's something I've heard. I know this wasn't the most interesting episode ever, but you really, sometimes in politics, you get stuck with the boring stories, so I want to thank you all for joining me on the podcast today. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is Just My Stupid Opinion. I'll see you all soon.